For the Water is Life series, we're tackling the most critical challenge facing island cities right now, which is preparing for and adapting to climate change. The recent IPCC report projects declining rainfall, more severe droughts, and a more intense hurricane season. Water security is and will be the defining issue for Caribbean islands. In each of these webinars, we intend to explore the scale of the problem and identify locally relevant solutions that can help us deal with our new climate reality. Today, we are acknowledging Jamaica's context of rapid urbanization and the failure of urban infrastructure to keep up with development. We're exploring the ways in which natural ecosystems like forests, wetlands, and mangroves can complement our existing infrastructure. My name is Jordan Chano. I'm the co-founder of Island City Lab. We're a Caribbean-based urban think tank dedicated to understanding the unique features and challenges of small island cities in the Caribbean. Our aim is to improve our built environment by building, fostering, and convening a network of civic thinkers to confront these challenges. And this forum is part of that programming. Today, we're speaking with three professionals who are working to expand the implementation of green infrastructure in the Caribbean. First, Renelle Sargent is the founder of Public Space Global, an NGO advocating for better urban places, and is also a Caribbean region liaison for the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. Her work in the public sector has included policy creation, community development, and leading the digitalization of Trinidad and Tobago's construction permitting system. Next, we have Shanice Bedwood Grant. She's the National Coordinator for the City Adapt Jamaica program, implemented by the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP. She has a Bachelor of Science in Meteorology and a Master's in Natural Resource Management, specializing in climate change. She has previously worked with the Meteorological Service and the National Environment and Planning Agency, NEPA. Finally, we have Howard Prendergast, a Senior Civil Engineer at the National Works Agency. He's a registered and certified professional engineer and has extensive experience in developing a variety of successful projects with specialization in stormwater management, flood control, and land and water development. To start, we wanted to level set and explain the jargon used in the title of the webinar. So first, gray infrastructure. What we mean by that is exclusively human-built and engineered systems that solve urban and environmental problems. So you can start to visualize gutters, pipes, tunnels, gullies, or seawalls. And also green infrastructure. What we mean by that is exclusively natural systems that solve those same problems. So you can visualize forests, wetlands, mangroves, or ponds. I'll turn it over to Renelle to give more context on green infrastructure.
Thank you so much, Jordan, and greetings to everyone. I'm joining you all from sunny Trinidad and Tobago this afternoon. I'm wearing my Public Space Global hat. Now at Public Space Global, we are urban advocates. We believe in creating better places for people and for the planet through public space design, through knowledge building activities, and through participatory methods. Now this afternoon, my role here is to provide an overview of green infrastructure or the potential for green infrastructure in the Caribbean. But I'm really aiming to be practical, I'm aiming to be strategic. So I'm going to give some examples of green infrastructure, talk about the benefits of green infrastructure, but I'd also like to work through the question of how do we continue or begin to implement green infrastructure in the Caribbean region. And I will be using my urban governance and urban design lens. So next slide, please, Jordan. Now, at the heart of the relationships between the built environment and nature in the Caribbean, a whole host of anthropocentric and biocentric views. Sometimes you hear people talking about humans being at the center and land and nature being viewed as a resource that we use, a resource that we exploit, a resource that we build upon. Other times you hear nature being viewed as a risk, a source of hazard, and therefore the need to defend against nature or to construct defensive structures against flooding, for instance. At the same time, you will hear people talk about the special relationships between people in the Caribbean and our very lovely landscapes. And often those views are the heart of conservation and environmental protection activities within the region. And there's a final view that I've begun to hear more recently in the region around ecosystem services, where we are considering the whole host of provisioning cultural and supporting services that ecosystems play. And we are attempting to value those services and promote those services within the urban environments. And from all of those views that I've described, it really sounds like a contradictory mix of things. And really it is. But what we often see reflected in the urban environment is that there is a preference for great infrastructure, infrastructures that can help us to control and to exploit nature in the urban environment. Next slide, please. Now, there are a whole host of green infrastructure interventions that have been considered internationally, less so in the Caribbean region. You tend to find it in Europe, in the US, increasingly in Asia and Latin America. There are interventions at a whole host of scales. At the building scale, you hear people talking about green roofs, green terraces, green walls. At the street level scale, you see things like permeable or porous pavements. You see rain gardens being implemented in some countries, and even street trees are a very simple intervention. On a broader scale, on a pathway scale or an urban corridor scale, we see interventions like urban agriculture, lots of channel restoration projects, and there are lots of nice ones happening in Mexico at the moment. We see things like detention and retention funds as well. So there are a whole host of infrastructure that can be considered under that umbrella of green infrastructure. Next slide, please. But those infrastructures really have a whole host of values. The difference between gray and green infrastructure is that typically green infrastructure, green interventions tend to provide multiple functions. So of course they do the environmental things that we want them to do. Water management is a big one, storage of flood waters, purification of water, the flood water management as well. But there are also environmental benefits like spaces for biodiversity that you get with green interventions. There are benefits around cooling, climate adaptation, and even climate mitigation with carbon sequestration, which happens through plants. But on the other side of things, on the human well-being side of things, there are lots of things that we depend on green infrastructures for. Our well-being, our mental health, spaces for recreation, spaces for physical activity. I've seen studies very recently which are talking about the restorative effects of nature, not necessarily in the Caribbean, but internationally, it's becoming more and more recognized. There was one study, I think done in 2017, that found that 27% of depression cases can be prevented by spending about 5 hours or more each week in a garden. So really, when you think about green infrastructure, you're thinking about those environmental and water management rules and those environmental rules that we want green infrastructure to play, but also things on the human well-being side of things that you can get, those services that you get from green infrastructure. Next slide, please. But implementing green infrastructure is not so simple. If you just look at the screen, there are a whole host of considerations, a constellation of considerations, you could call it, that we need to look at. Do we have the financial resources for green infrastructure projects? Do we have the human resources? Do we have the people who have the skills to implement these sorts of projects? Does green infrastructure, doesn't have to be mandated or regulated by governments? Can it fit within existing planning and construction permitting systems? Is there capacity to develop new policies and new standards if you need to? You also need to think about who are the stakeholders involved and how can we get a broad coalition of stakeholders involved in implementing green infrastructure from the community, government, civil society, professionals as well. But there are also other considerations around designing green infrastructure. Now, it may seem simple that you plant some trees or you plant some vegetation and you have green infrastructure, but it's actually something that you need to put a lot of thought into. For instance, what are the types of vegetation that you need? If you have larger leaves, those types of plants are able to better purify the air than plants with smaller leaves, for instance. Or do you need to have vegetation with deeper roots, which increases the infiltration capacity of the soil as well? You need to think about whether you're implementing individual interventions on a piecemeal basis, or you're thinking about the entire urban system and the network or the infrastructure that needs to take place on a citywide or watershed-wide scale. You're thinking about the future climatic conditions. So an intervention that you implement today, will it have to deal with drought conditions or more intense rainfall in the future as well? And of course, there are always trade-offs with implementing green infrastructure. Trade-offs may be as simple as when you increase plants and water within urban spaces in our lovely tropical environments, you tend to have an increase in mosquitoes and vector-borne diseases. So management of green infrastructural spaces is also important. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a couple examples from other parts of the world to illustrate how you begin to think through those issues around green infrastructure. So I'm going to start with an example from Sri Lanka. It's the Badagana urban wetland, which was implemented in 2016. Now it's an 18-hectare wetland. The city is famous for its wetlands. However, there has been lots of degradation of the wetlands in the city. Now that demonstration project was implemented as one part of a series of 8 interventions within the city. Those interventions were both green and gray infrastructure interventions. Within the wetland space, they constructed a boardwalk. They removed waste from the water, and they also replanted some of the native species. So now we have a space that fulfills the role of floodwater management within the city, but we also have a space that is used for recreation by people who live around the area. And it's also used as a space for ecotourism because you have a lot of wildlife, particularly birds, coming within this space since it has been rehabilitated. Now, the good thing about this space is that there has been an assessment done of the impact of this green infrastructure intervention, and there were 23 individual sustainability benefits found. I'll just highlight two main ones. Firstly, they found that over 100 structures within the broader area are now protected or at lower vulnerability to flooding, as well as 1,200 people who live within that area. And that's a significant percentage of the people who live within that broader area. They also found other benefits, for instance, a 1 degree cooling of air temperatures just by implementing that. I will also quickly just go through 2 other examples. Go to the next slide. In Singapore, Waterway Ridges is a 4-hectare public housing project which was implemented. It utilized 4 types of interventions: rain gardens, bioretention lawns, and vegetated swales as well. What they did find is that 60% of the runoff within that new housing development implemented by the government, actually its water is managed through those green spaces implemented in the development. Next slide, please. However, that development was not implemented alone. It was part of a broader strategy within the city-state called the ABC Waters Program, which really just takes a catchment-wide approach, looking at multiple interventions which happen at different scales. So at the building scale, some places you have green roofs, in some places you have porous pavements, there are constructed wetlands, channel renaturalization also happened within that area. So really, that is one intervention that is part of a broader strategy implemented within Singapore. Next slide, please. And I will just very quickly give the example of Trinidad and Tobago because we have tried to do that. We implemented a detention pond in 2014. It was not as successful, unfortunately. It was supposed to be one measure as part of a broader range of flood alleviation methods, but those other methods did not come to fruition. And we found today, even last month in August, we had some of the worst flooding in the city that we've had for years. So we see that although you implement one measure, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will address the totality of the issues that you face within a city-state. So I will just wrap up, next slide, please, by saying one final thing, that based on those examples and based on some of the issues that I've raised, that really there are 4 priority areas for action. How do we change those mindsets and those narratives that we tell ourselves around the environment and nature? I think that's important for spurring action. We also need to build the knowledge around what are the interventions that work within the Caribbean context and how do those interventions perform, thinking about the regulations and guidelines and different tools that professionals and communities can use to implement these projects, but also using the existing implementation pathways. And climate adaptation and climate mitigation projects in the region, I think, are one of the pathways that we can exploit to further introduce green infrastructure within the Caribbean. Thanks so much. And I look forward to continuing this discussion in the panel.
Thank you so much, Renelle. Now I'll turn it over to Shanice to introduce the City Adapt programs in Jamaica.
Good morning. Welcome everyone, and thanks for having me. I'm the national coordinator for the City Adapt project in Jamaica, as was said before. And this project, the long name for the project, is the Building Climate Resilience for Urban Systems through Ecosystems-Based Adaptations in Latin America and the Caribbean region. And this is a unique project because if you know, a lot of the times the EBA projects are really based in the interior and the upper watersheds. And so now this one is trying to bring together urban areas and improving EBA within those areas for the benefits. Next slide, please. Thanks. So the project started in 2018 and will end December 2023. It's worth mentioning that it's a regional project and it's being conducted in 3 medium-sized cities across the region, and the region being Latin America and the Caribbean. The other 2 countries, inclusive of Jamaica, are Mexico and El Salvador. And the project is being funded by the Special Climate Change Fund of the Global Environment Facility. The project is being implemented by the United Nations Environment Program in conjunction with the Climate Change Division in Jamaica. Next slide, please. Okay, so the major objective of the project is looking at improving the capacity of not only government, but also local communities in 3 cities across the Caribbean to adapt to the effects of climate change through the integration of EBA into urban planning for the medium and long term. Next slide. And this has been done through 3 components. Now these components, the first component speaks to looking at mainstreaming EBA into long-term and medium-term urban development. And for this, we are looking mainly at policies and how can we get EBA included in the policies as they are now. And so that could serve as a baseline moving forward. The second component of the project looks at demonstration of urban EBA interventions in the cities. So under this aspect of the project, we are looking at implementing actual pilot activities that can serve as examples of what can be done and the benefits that could be had from implementing these different EBA activities. And the third component of the project looks at, okay, so we've done this now, what have we learned? What can we share with the rest of the region, the rest of the world, and other similar regions across the world? And how can we learn from this and move forward using these activities that we've put in place? Next slide. So just to give an idea of some of the pilot activities that we'll be implementing as a project, I must take the time to acknowledge our partners, the Forestry Department, the Jamaica Forage Clubs, and the Nature Conservancy. So we've been working closely with our partners, and we have been looking at things such as reforesting areas within the upper watershed. Now, you know, reforestation has a lot of benefits within itself. Increase infiltration, reduce runoff, and this assists, or this will kind of eliminate some of the flooding that would usually happen on the lower areas of the city. And so the project has set out to plant 4,200 trees in the upper watershed areas in the Hope watershed. And to date, the Forestry Department has planted over 7,000 trees. And they are actually embarking on planting more. We also looked at planting some trees within the city, and they have been doing well with that as well. They've completed that activity. And some rainwater harvesting systems will be done by the Jamaica Forage Club. Some has been done already. And one thing that I think we're quite excited about is the Jamaica Forage Club. They're looking at, okay, so there's this one site that they're looking at that had road construction done recently. And so the water from the road has been impacting that building. And so they're looking at how can we now get this water from the road and use it in some sort of productive way within the cities. I must also mention the policy briefs being done by the Nature Conservancy. These are something that we're looking forward to, looking at what policies we will be able to get or to provide some guidance as to what can be done to improve or to increase EBA within cities. And lastly, our vulnerability assessment, which will be looking at, okay, we have done these things already. What else? What are the other gaps that can be filled? What can we do? What can we implement? So thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Shanice. Now finally, I'll turn it over to Howard to talk about NAA's role, the National Works Agency role in all this, and a proposal, a green infrastructure proposal that they actually recommended in their master drainage plan. Go ahead, Howard.
Hi, morning, everyone. Thanks for the introduction. Morning again, everyone. My name is Howard Prendergast from the National Works Agency. I'm one of the senior civil engineers in the agency, in the Technical Services Directorate. Primarily, as I think we all know, hopefully, that the NAA is pretty much responsible for our main road network, but not only that, we're also responsible for flood control systems and drainage systems across the island. An interesting part also is that we are also responsible for carrying out review of proposed developments and subdivisions, be it residential or commercial, or just like a service station or a gas station development. We have a planning and research unit in the agency that actually receive these applications, and in turn the Technical Services Directorate, in my directorate, we actually do review of these applications. What we have been doing over the years is we're trying to strengthen our capacity to look at these development applications, not just environmentally, but also in terms of looking at how much we can use the whole concept, green versus gray infrastructure, see how much we can incorporate in the designs, the proposed designs, to minimize or lessen the impacts that development runoff have. As we know, our systems are very, well, most of our drains, for example, in Kingston and other urban areas, are pretty much outdated, inadequate, and adding more development will add more pressure to these systems. So the idea about the concept gray versus green infrastructure makes sense because as Shana was explaining in Trinidad, for example, if we can use these systems to reduce or minimize the impact on the existing system, it will go a long way. On top of that, we also think from our water resources issue, right, before I go there. So as you're seeing on the screen is we in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, we carried out a master drainage study and had some critical locations identified across the island, not everywhere, but some critical locations. One of the urban areas that we're looking at is the Hagley Park Road, which was recently completed among several more projects in the Kingston area. Runoff, the catchment area that contributes runoff into the Hagley Park area, a lot of that runoff also comes further from Ligani, Hope Road and other areas and dumped directly onto Hagley Park Road. What you're seeing on the screen is pretty much upstream, upslope of Hagley Park Road, Halfway Tree Road. And the idea was that since there's so much water coming down into Halfway Tree onto Hagley Park Road, we in the study we actually identified some lands where you see detention pond, where we direct or divert some of this runoff from the Hope Road into this detention pond to reduce the amount of water that goes down into Halfway Tree at the Park Road, thus reducing or lessening or minimizing the impact further down. And that also in turn can reduce the infrastructure costs on Hagley Park Road. Unfortunately, Hagley Park Road also got implemented, that project got implemented recently. This was not incorporated in that implementation of the Hagley Park Road. But conceptually, we think it would have been a good idea, and we would like to see, we're trying to make this concept happen more in other locations, whether it's urban areas, Kingston, Mobile, new developments. It's one of our policy, I should say, that for new developments, for proposed developments, we encourage, we recommend, and sometimes insist that creating detention areas, detention ponds, and so on, greener areas to offset or minimize, reduce the impact of development runoff on the existing system and our network. So the NAA is pretty much very much aware and would like to see this concept being implemented right across wherever possible, especially in the urban areas, especially as we have this urban boom, so to speak, housing boom across the urban areas. We'd like to see a lot of these projects being implemented. I would like to also highlight that in architects, planners, developers, they also try to incorporate measures such as permeable pavement, porous pavements. Those are absorption pits, soak away detention pits, storage tanks from rooftops. These are pretty much measures that we recommend, and sometimes, as I said, insist that these measures be put in place to reduce the runoff and incorporate more greener areas wherever possible. So we at the NAA, yes, we are trying very hard, but the problem, one of the issues that we have, I should say, I don't want to say problem, is that we have a lot of hard infrastructure, and with hard infrastructure come a lot of runoff. So we welcome projects like these to make everyone more aware that incorporating simple measures such as detention ponds, greener areas, rain gardens, all these measures can be used to achieve what we're trying to achieve. Green as opposed to gray.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If there are any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Howard. Now we'll transition into the panel discussion. And I think hearing all this, the first question I have is, why is there this preference for gray infrastructure over green infrastructure? Is it that we're sort of stuck in our ways? Considering the immense cost of implementing infrastructure on taxpayers and that it has to be debt financed, why are we still, so focused on this preference for gray infrastructure? This question is for everybody, but let's start with Howard first.
Okay, thank you, Jordan. I'm not too sure if I can answer that question politically correct, but I'll try from my little understanding. When we think NAA, we think about main roads, we think about highways, we think about, hard infrastructure. We do incorporate some degree of, tree planting, wetland restoration, preservation. The thought is there, But as to why we we don't implement it at a much higher level, it's perhaps it's like, for example, you know, we have a lot of vehicles running on petrol. Is that's the best way to do it. And now we're trying to go into EVs, electric vehicles and stuff like that. So it could be very well be that we have a tradition or culture of just doing things certain ways, and we need to become more aware, more educated as to the benefit, so we can transition into a greener environment, so to speak. I don't have the answer, politically speaking, but my answer is that we need to just continue doing what we're doing, make people, make institutions, make government more aware that such concepts make sense. And in the long run, I think we should be able to see much more benefits from it.
Renelle, what are your thoughts on that question?
Maybe I will just jump in to say that, Jordan, when you asked the question, I think you hit the nail on the head. It really just has become long-standing practice. We understand, or we have become accustomed to developing grey infrastructures to meet our water quality needs in urban centers, to bring water from some of the more pristine areas into our towns and cities. And we just have continued to do it over time. It's not a development trend that has escaped the Caribbean. And we also do have a tendency to be wary of doing new things. At least I will say in the Trinidad and Tobago context, and the professionals that work in the context, there is that tendency to be a little bit wary and unsure about trying something new. But I will also add that insofar infrastructure development is a reflection of our mindsets and norms around the environment. It's also a reflection of the education and training and the frameworks of governance that we have for infrastructure within the Caribbean. If our manuals, although some people may speak the green lingo, our manuals are still very gray. We use the AASHTO, the other things that professionals within the sector use, particularly the engineers, they are all still very gray. And if those are the documentation that we use, and we don't necessarily have something that has been tried and tested in the Caribbean context, of course, there's going to be less willingness or less adoption of these practices. So I think we also need to consider the knowledge and skills and training and manuals and tools and all of those things that we use as professionals.
Shanika, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in to say I do agree with everything that was said before. And for me, it really is about education and getting persons to understand the benefits of these different initiatives or interventions. I mean, projects like mine, who we are out there doing some pilots, putting things on the ground so you can see this was done and these are the benefits, the long-term benefits of it. And so it will get persons to understand that these are some benefits that could be had from these things and to know about it. And also, I think it is also one of the challenges is it might take a longer time to see to get the benefits from these EBA interventions. Because I mean, comparing building a wall to planting some mangroves, you have to wait until those would have matured. And so this is where it comes in now, that I think we'll talk about a little later, about getting that mix and getting them to work together instead of trying to focus on just one, because we do need to get that immediate fix in some instances. And we also need to get that longer term, more beneficial thing.
Right. It's interesting. Renelle did mention how engineers use standards to design. When we spoke to Howard, he talked about the AASHTO standards for roads, British standards for bridges. So I'm wondering, Howard, what is the appetite for a green standard, developing a green standard for engineering practices in the Caribbean? And I think also, Shanice, I think the work that you're doing is also feeding into that. How do we start to develop green engineering standards? Let me start with Howard. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Quickly. Well, in 2015, we launched our, in short, drainage guidelines for development. We recognized then and before that we need to capture this aspect in terms of utilizing more detention ponds, more green infrastructure in our development. So we are aware, and we still are. The document has been available since 2015, and to a great extent, I think engineers, architects, developers, planners are utilizing the guidelines to incorporate these concepts. I still think, however, that it has not, the penetration is still not there to make it as advanced as we would desire. So I might have missed your question, Jordan. Tell me a question again, please.
I was wondering what the appetite is within the public bodies to start to develop more green standards. Right. I personally think that people like green spaces, even if it's in a small apartment. I think the appetite is there because when you're in an apartment or in a townhouse, you want a little space. Even if you go on your patio or your veranda, whatever the case might be, you try to create these green areas. It's just, I think the appetite is there. However, the conditions that persist perhaps might not allow it to the extent that you want. So right now we're trying high density development, for example, in Kingston and other urban areas. So I think the focus really, given the appetite that is there, and I think it is there, but if you're investing your money, you want to see profit. That's the bottom line. So we need to see where we can make that bridge, where we can draw that line to still make profit in your investment and still achieving to some degree or to a greater degree some greenery, so to speak. So I think the appetite is there. We're fully aware, and the appetite is there. Just need to keep working at it and until we can get better. Got it. Another thing that we've heard is that green infrastructure and gray infrastructure are at odds with each other. We spoke to forestry, and they talked about wanting to plant street trees, but it being at odds with NAA's infrastructure. So the question really is, can the two start to support each other and work in more synergistic ways instead of being at odds with each other? Can we start to design our environment to incorporate the two in a more holistic way? I think you answered your question, yes. I personally think you answered your question, yes. It's a matter of synchronizing the gray and the green more together and achieve outcomes on both sides. For example, if you're building, say, a roadway, there's not only one way to build a roadway. You can build a roadway with permeable pavement, for example. And permeable pavement, I mean, it's nothing new. It's around the world already. To drive on, not just to walk on in walkway or parking ways. You can have drivable pavements that are permeable. So you reduce the infrastructure costs. You reduce your runoff rate. You can have trees to the side without massive infrastructure to the side. So it's really just to find a balance. So the question is, I think you've answered the question. Yes, I think there is big room for synergy, for collaboration. It's just a matter of working together. I think maybe that's perhaps the key word in this answer, is that more we collaborate, we can put our ideas and our concepts more in sync to get the outcomes that we want. And we can, I think there's a lot of room for it. Great. I think want to bring Renella and Shanice into it. Renella, you were saying something?
I was just about to jump in to tell Howard I'm in complete agreement with you. I don't think the question is whether it's either or. The starting point should be that we think about them as complementary to each other. And I think one of the selling points of integrating green infrastructures with gray is that you are able to achieve some of the larger benefits that you wouldn't necessarily get with the gray infrastructures. Things like the recreational spaces, spaces for sociability, the mental health benefits, and that's something that we definitely needed during the pandemic. And those are some of the social issues that you find that people tend to be more responsive to. When you tell narratives around green infrastructure being able to deliver those things, I think an individual person, individual communities are drawn to those things. But I will also say that it's still a question, and I will always go back to this about the evidence for the performance of these hybrid infrastructures. I haven't really seen many studies that look at how these two perform together and what is the right mix of green and gray. Which types of green infrastructure work with other types of work with gray infrastructure. There was a study, I'll just wrap up quickly. There was a study done by the IDA in 2014 that did a cost-benefit analysis of green infrastructure or climate adaptation measures in Trinidad and Tobago. And you tend to think that, green infrastructure, although it may be a little bit longer term in terms of impact, it's probably a little bit cheaper. But what they did find is that a lot of the measures, a lot of green infrastructure measures are actually a bit expensive, particularly because it's something new that we're playing with, new designs that we have to develop. We have to sometimes bring in international consultants. So I will say that that question around the evidence and performance of infrastructure is something that we definitely need to answer to be able to implement green infrastructure, implement hybrid solutions of green and green.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in to say the same thing that Renelle just said. We need to have that research and that the evidence that shows that these things do work and that they can coexist. I mean, the evidence that we have so far, what we've been doing over the years are great infrastructure. So this is what we know that works for different things. So we need to now have different pilots that show this can work here or that can work there as well. And these are the benefits of it. And I think it also comes down to planning. Everybody coming and having a seat at the table. So NWA doesn't plan on their own in terms of retrofitting this road, but they bring in a forestry and they bring in a NEPA and they see, okay, so these are the challenges that we're having. How do we now come together and plan to address this in a way that will allow for both gray and green infrastructure to come through and to work together? So I think it comes down to research, evidence, and planning.
Great. So I guess I'll transition into more of a policy question or regulation question. And I'll start with Shanice. What are the policies that are necessary to start to support an advancement of green infrastructure?
Well, again, I'll start right where I left off, planning. Planning has to be at the forefront. Whatever is being done in the cities, I think the cities are largely, while we might have some some development that is not approved, but largely these developments that has to go through the planning process, these should be captured within that. So the planning policies, the planning, the NEPAs and the municipal corporations, these persons has to be engaged to now say, what are these policies that we can use to now say, these are the things that has to be done. The forestry department has to come in and say, all right, so you're planning to develop this area, but we need you to maintain this section as this, or we need you to put this in. So under our project, what we are doing, we are looking at now talking to the different entities who work within planning and urban development to see what are these policies that could be adjusted. What are these policies that they may be up for renewal or what's the word? They're up to be reassessed or to be improved. So these policies, how can we now get this into it to get that medium to long-term change that we're seeking to have?
Renelle, what do you think policy-wise?
As the urban planner at the table, this is a difficult question for me. I clearly understand the challenges and the deficiencies we have within planning systems across the region. Planning systems are considered to be slow. At least policy processes are very slow. And even when you do come up with some sort of policies not implemented, or you have developers who act with impunity and don't necessarily follow the regulations that are created. But I still, I definitely do think that there is a role for policy, but we probably need to think about more flexible forms of policy, but also reconsider how and what we regulate. I just had the thought that if you have 50 individual households, you won't necessarily have much green infrastructure implemented in those 50 individual household applications. but the resources that a planning agency may put to that will far exceed the resources that you have to a larger scale housing development that has 50 housing units, and where you have much more opportunity to do some green infrastructure interventions. But I also think like those sorts of interventions need to be considered under the broader citywide or urban area-wide or watershed-wide scale. It shouldn't be that you just implement individual interventions in different places and they don't all make sense together and they are not all playing particular roles together. But you also need to look at the site-specific scale. There needs to be detailed guidelines for someone who wants to or who is mandated to implement some sort of green infrastructure intervention. What's for developer? What is the guideline to tell them which is the green infrastructure intervention you select? What's the size of the intervention that you need? How do you design that particular intervention? Those are some of the things that we need to be considering on the site-specific scale. But again, I will go back to that. Our policy process is so very slow. So we really need to think about more flexible ways of coming up with policies and new types of faster policy creation or policy modification processes. So that's my input on the question of policy and planning and regulation.
Well, thanks a lot for now. Just want to start to transition into audience questions now. One member asked, what are the lessons from the Trinidad detention ponds that Kingston can learn? And I guess this is for Renelle.
I will be very brief, but one thing I think I said during the presentation that one intervention is not going to solve all of your problems. It has to be part of a broader strategy. I think one of the things that they also learned when they implemented that project is that they put in a detention pond, but that detention pond ended up being the source of flooding for streets around the detention pond. There was no pump implemented at the time to help move water faster when they were during periods of heavy rainfall. So again, it's not just about an individual intervention. That green infrastructure measure probably needed to be complemented with a green measure like some of the pumps. And they did go into implement some pumps a couple of years later on. I will also say that although it wasn't necessarily successful, what did happen is that the talk about detention ponds, the use of detention ponds has created a norm that where we do see that larger developments are now being mandated to implement detention ponds in other parts of the country. So it's not just within Port of Spain. Lots of new subdivision developments throughout the country are mandated and have been implementing detention ponds. It has also, maybe not necessarily a lesson, but I think just the introduction of a green infrastructure measure has helped to increase, and Jordan used the word before, the appetite for green infrastructure. So there are newer watershed projects which are coming in. There's one in the southern parts of the country that is starting this year that is not just looking at detention ponds, but they're looking at rainwater harvesting. It's meshed with coastal and wetlands rehabilitation, and very importantly, developer knowledge building activities and capacity building activities for developers who will be required to implement some of these measures within their development. So there are lots of lessons. One, integrate green and gray. Two, you need a broader strategy and you need a range of measures. And three, once you begin to implement these sorts of measures, you kind of teach people that it's something that is possible and something that can be done.
So just to bring Howard back into this, one thing that was brought up again in the conversation was the question of human capital resources, expertise to enforce these sort of green infrastructure projects. At NWA, it seems that there's a lot of expertise there. Is this possible? Do we have the human capital within our agencies to start to implement these projects? Howard, that's for you. Howard, you're muted.
Yes, no, I had a little connectivity issue. Could you repeat the question, please?
I was asking what are the human capital resources or the expertise within public agencies in Jamaica specifically to start to think about these approaches as well as implement them and enforce them?
Right. In terms of implementation, I would prefer not to answer that question. But in terms of having the ideas, having the understanding the concepts that are needed, I think we do have those in-house in our government agencies. I'm speaking about the NAA, I'm speaking about NEPA and other agencies. In terms of the implementation aspect, I think we might be lacking in terms of the resources there. Implementation comes also with enforcement. You can build something, you can implement something, but if you don't enforce or maintain what you put down, you're going to lose it eventually, or it doesn't function the way it should function. And that's part of, I think that's a big part of our problem, is that when we do implement things, we don't have enough maintenance or even enforcement to ensure that, for example, your infrastructure, your road infrastructure or your road furniture don't get damaged. When they get damaged, somebody not on a street light or a tree, somebody should do it, and it just stays there. But I think intellectually, academically, and likewise, I think we do have that in-house, the different departments. The implementation, I couldn't say if we were adequate. We're okay with that. I want to say. Chanel said something. I think it was Chanel or Shanice. They did mention about bringing in international consultants to do certain things and stuff. I don't necessarily form that opinion. I think we have beautiful minds throughout the Caribbean that can come up with many ideas. I think that international consultancy, with all due respect, they're normally, it's normally married to some kind of project that needs to get implemented. And I think that's where the connection is more than anything. Most of us were in the Caribbean, in the agencies. I would say most of us are internationally trained. So we're already international consultants, so to speak. I would think so. Even if it's UE is international. So I think, I think we do have that resource. I think we do have it. We can always get case studies from Singapore and other countries, Japan, wherever the case, but that will go a long way. But I think intellectually, academically, experience-wise, I think we do have a lot of expertise, resources in-house throughout the Caribbean that we can undertake these kind of projects, concepts, programs.
Thank you. So thank you guys so much for joining us on this sort of journey into green infrastructure. To sort of end the conversation with more optimism and with some highlights, I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Shanice, what is your vision for green infrastructure in Jamaica?
Well, my vision is that one day green and great infrastructure will coexist, and we'll be able to see the benefits of both. As I said, I do believe that it will happen. There are projects coming in that are like my project, putting out pilots, we're embarking on long-term research programs at the university. So we're adding to that research base and that evidence base that we need. And so once we do that, I believe that one day we'll have the research, we'll have the evidence, we'll have the policies that will support this, and we'll have both green and green infrastructure coexisting and helping us adapt better to climate change.
Ronald, same question for you, but for Trinidad.
So I will present a regional vision for green infrastructure in the Caribbean. What I would like to see, or rather what I would like to hear, is really a groundswell of voices who are advocating for green infrastructure across the region. but those voices should also be able to offer a menu of solutions that are suitable to the local context. Solutions at the building scale, solutions at the street scale, and solutions at the broader urban area scale. I think that means that we need to have a cadre of professionals, different professions who are working within the space, who are implementing projects, and who are able to build that momentum. That will mean that, you know, if there's someone who's working in Trinidad, they can reach out to Howard or reach out to Shanice and get some information on some of those projects. Or maybe go to the websites and get information on those projects. Maybe get a how-to manual and a how-to manual that allows them to implement in their own context, or to learn the lessons that Howard and Shanice and all the other persons who have been working at other places in the Caribbean and green infrastructure have been learning. So really it's about we all need to be advocating, but we all need to be sharing information and learning from each other across the region.
And Howard, your vision?
My vision is collaboration. I think if we just work together, all the planners, the architects, the engineers, the agencies, just come together more and hear out and not just be selfish, so to speak, in the different entities, agencies, I think we can achieve much more. My vision is a green earth, green Jamaica, green Caribbean, and globally speaking. I think it can be done. It might be very hard now, given all that is happening, but guess what? If we don't start somewhere, we'll never reach there. So this is our opportunity to educate, make people more aware, and so we can, become more aware overall. We have to start somewhere. The problem, I think it is, and if I had much time, we could speak more, but I think part of our problem, and I see it throughout the Caribbean also, not only the Caribbean, but just being specific, is that while you and I as grown-ups can see this and understand what needs to be done, chances are a lot of it probably won't get done in our lifetime. So we need to start in the kindergarten, in the basic school, the primary school. I think that is where we should spend a lot of energy. So that another 10, 15 years from now, we can actually see it bearing good fruit. That's my point.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists, Howard, Renelle, Shanice, for participating in this conversation, and to everyone who showed up for the event. The Water is Life webinar series is continuing. Look out for marketing coming up in the next following weeks. Next topics include water, waste, and density, where we take a closer look at the mass urbanization in Kingston and St. Andrew, or across Jamaica really, and how our water resources are responding to that. And finally, what does climate change mean for our agricultural products? Can we sustain agriculture within cities? So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate it. Thanks again to the panelists. Shanice, for all the work that you've been doing to push green infrastructure forward in Jamaica. Renelle, for all the advocacy through Public Space Global, for public space livable placemaking in the Caribbean, for Howard, for all the work that you've been doing with NWA to maintain our infrastructure and to talk to us about what's going on behind the scenes. Really appreciate it, guys.
A lot more is going on.
Thank
you for having us also. Do appreciate it.
Take care, all.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.